It was a dark and rainy night, typical of a crime thriller. The city streets were almost deserted, except for the raindrops that fell persistently, making a soft sound on the sidewalks. Detective David Coleman sat in his office, the dim lamplight illuminating the stacks of files on his desk. He was known for his ability to solve complex cases, but that night he had no work. Boredom was beginning to set in when the phone on the table rang, breaking the oppressive silence. David picked up the phone and answered in a serious, firm voice. Detective Coleman. The voice of his partner, Detective Sarah Mitchell, sounded on the other end of the line. David, we have a new case. A strange case. David frowned. What happened, Sarah? Sarah explained that a man named Richard Turner had mysteriously disappeared. Richard was a respected university professor in the city and had no history of personal problems or known enemies. However, he had disappeared without a trace. The last clue to his whereabouts linked him to an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. David was instantly interested. He enjoyed challenges, especially when they involved mystery and intrigue. He agreed to meet Sarah and investigate the case that same night. As he drove through the city in the persistent rain, David pondered what could be happening. Disappearances were indeed his specialty, but this case seemed different. The abandoned house was an eerie setting, a place where urban legends and horror stories were created. When David arrived at the scene, he found Sarah waiting in her police car. She looked at him with a serious look and said, "We're about to enter uncharted territory, David." He nodded and grabbed a flashlight and his gun before getting out of the car. Together, they approached the abandoned house, whose walls were covered in ivy and windows were broken. The night was pitch black except for the lights of the lanterns. Sarah cautiously opened the door, revealing a dusty, cobweb-filled interior. The atmosphere in the house was heavy and sinister, as if it was permeated with years of unsolved mystery. David and Sarah explored the rooms, finding furniture covered in sheets and dusty objects that revealed the property's abandonment. As they progressed, they began to notice disturbing clues. Old books with cryptic writings, old faded photographs, and strange symbols painted on the walls. While investigating the basement, David's flashlight illuminated a horrifying scene. A series of photographs were spread across the floor, revealing missing people, including Richard Turner, tied up and with expressions of terror. There were also notes with dates and names, suggesting a pattern of disappearances over the years. Sarah looked at David with an expression of horror. "This is terrible. We need to find out what's going on here." David agreed, but a feeling of uneasiness began to grow in his chest. They were not alone in that abandoned house. Something or someone was watching them from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The night promised to reveal dark secrets that would test the courage of even the best detectives. As David and Sarah continued to explore the secrets of the abandoned house, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the wind seemed to whisper that something was wrong in this sinister place. David was determined to uncover the truth behind the mysterious disappearances. He examined notes in the basement, finding connections between the dates of the disappearances and specific astronomical events, such as lunar and solar eclipses. Those symbols on the walls started to make sense when he realized they were part of mysterious rituals. "This is so much more than an ordinary missing persons case," David whispered to Sarah. They decided to explore the attic, where they hoped to find more clues. They climbed the dusty stairs with the light of their flashlights illuminating the way. In the attic, they come across a room full of old boxes piled up. As they rummaged through the boxes, they found even older records, dating back decades. They were diaries written by a woman named Elijah Morgan, who seemed to have an obsession with the occult. Her writings were full of references to dark rituals, sacrifices, and the search for supernatural immortality. David and Sarah exchanged worried looks. It seemed that the house's history was intertwined with sinister events that had been occurring decades ago. But what did this have to do with the recent disappearances, including that of Richard Turner? As they pondered this, they heard a sound coming from outside the attic, a shuffling of feet that seemed to get closer. They looked at each other and they quickly turned off the flashlights, plunging the room into darkness. Slow, shuffling footsteps echoed through the attic. David and Sarah held their breath, listening intently. It was then that a chilling whisper filled the air. "You shouldn't be here." David recognized the voice of Eliza Morgan, the woman from the diaries, but she should have been dead decades ago. Without making a sound, they turned on the lanterns again and illuminated the figure of a pale, decrepit woman wearing an antique dress standing in the corner of the attic. "Who are you?" David demanded, his voice firm despite his growing fear. The woman, or whatever she was, smiled sinisterly. "I am Eliza Morgan, and this is my home. You have invaded my sanctuary." David and Sarah were stunned. Eliza seemed like an apparition from another world. How could someone from the past be there, in that abandoned house? Eliza continued, "I sought immortality and found it in a dark way. Those who disappeared were part of my rituals. Their souls fueled my eternal existence." David drew his gun, pointing it at Eliza's ghostly figure. "You're not going to get away with this." But before he could do anything, the woman disappeared in a black mist, leaving them perplexed. Sarah looked at David, her face pale. "What did we just see?" David lowered the gun, still perplexed by what had happened. "I'm not sure, Sarah, but it looks like we just witnessed something supernatural." They knew they needed to investigate deeper to unlock the mystery of the abandoned house and its dark secret of immortality. As the rain continued to fall outside, David and Sarah were determined to discover the truth and face the terror that the night still held for them. David and Sarah, shaken by their encounter with the supernatural figure of Eliza Morgan, decided they needed to delve even deeper into the mysteries surrounding the abandoned house. They returned to the basement, where the mysterious notes and symbols seemed to be the key to unlocking the dark truth behind the disappearances. While studying the notes, David realized that the rituals mentioned had a direct connection to astronomical events. There were mentions of specific dates, moon phases, and planet alignments. It appeared that Eliza Morgan had used the cosmos as part of her rituals to achieve immortality. Sarah, her eyes fixed on her notes, said in a low voice, "What if these rituals are still happening? What if someone is following in Eliza's footsteps?" David nodded, understanding what she meant. They had to find a way to stop whatever ritual was in progress and save those who were still in danger. The notes mentioned a specific location in the forest near the house where the rituals were performed. It was a place called Moonlight, and it seemed to be the epicenter of Eliza's occult activities. Determined to confront the evil that was plaguing the abandoned house, David and Sarah set out towards Claro de Lua, guided by information from Eliza's diaries. The rain was still falling, turning the surroundings into a muddy, gloomy quagmire. After a tense walk through the forest, they arrived at the Moonlight. It was then that they saw something that made their hearts freeze. In the center of the clearing, there was a circle of lit black candles, and hooded figures stood around them, reciting unintelligible words in an ancient language. David and Sarah knew they were too late to stop the ritual from starting, but they could still stop it before it was completed. They crept through the darkness, staying in the shadows, watching the rituals take place. As the hooded men continued their invocations, something began to emerge from the ground in the center of the circle. It was a dark, viscous substance that seemed to writhe as if it were alive. It was the manifestation of Eliza's ritual. David whispered to Sarah, "We have to act now before it's too late." They emerged from the shadows, surprising the cultists. David pointed his gun, while Sarah held a flashlight. The bright glow of the lantern revealed the horrified faces of the cultists, who were about to complete the ritual that would bring immortality. "Leave it immediately," ordered David. The cultists hesitated for a moment, but when the viscous ritual substance began to move toward them, they finally complied. They extinguished the black candles and stepped back, leaving the circle. It was then that the dark substance seemed to lose its shape and dissipate, as if the interruption of the ritual had weakened it. David and Sarah breathed a sigh of relief, but knew they still had a lot to discover. David approached one of the cultists who was about to flee and stopped him. "What were you guys doing here? Who's behind this?" The cultist, shaking with fear, finally broke the silence. She promised us immortality, but we didn't know that was what would happen." With the cultist's information, David and Sarah began to understand the truth behind the ritual. Eliza Morgan, in search of immortality, had created a cult that continued its rituals even after her death. They were trapped in a dark cycle of searching for eternal life without realizing the consequences of their actions. They turned the cultist over to local authorities and decided to further investigate Eliza Morgan's story and how to stop her once and for all. The rain continued to fall, but this time it seemed like a blessing, washing away the darkness of the abandoned house and the moonlight. David and Sarah knew they had solved part of the mystery, but they still needed to understand how to combat a threat that transcended life, is the death. The police terror that had started as a simple disappearance had turned into a fight against supernatural forces, and they were willing to face the unknown to protect the innocent. David and Sarah delve even deeper into the search for the truth about Eliza Morgan and the curse hanging over the abandoned house. They knew that facing the supernatural was dangerous territory, but they were determined to figure out how to end the threat. Returning to the local library, they searched for any clue that would lead them to understand the secrets of Eliza's immortality. While searching the dusty archives, they found an ancient book that talked about occult practices and forbidden rituals. The book described an ancient sealing spell that, according to legend, could imprison a supernatural entity. The description matched the rituals mentioned in Eliza's notes. It was a risk, but David and Sarah decided to give it a try. They gathered the necessary materials, including white candles, salt, and mystical symbols drawn on the floor. The chosen night was one in which the stars and moon were aligned according to the information in Eliza's notes. As they recited the spell, a feeling of pulsing energy filled the room. The house itself seemed to shake, and the temperature dropped drastically. David and Sarah felt a dark presence approaching. At the last moment, when the ritual was almost finished, a shadowy, translucent figure emerged from the shadows. It was the spirit of Eliza Morgan, her eyes empty and her face contorted in agony. "You dare disturb my rest?" Her voice echoed like an icy whisper. David and Sarah didn't back down. They were determined to end the cycle of death and destruction that Eliza had created. Sarah held up the locket she had found in the house and showed it to the spectral figure. "You are no longer the mistress of this house. Your reign of terror must end." Eliza's spirit writhed and screamed. Her spectral form began to slowly disintegrate. The sealing spell was working, but before she completely disappeared, she cast a final curse. "You can seal me away, but the darkness will always find a way back. This house will be my eternal prison, but it will never stop me completely." With an anguished cry, Eliza's spirit disappeared, leaving behind only a dark echo. David and Sarah knew they had triumphed, at least temporarily. They closed the abandoned house and placed magical seals to prevent anyone from disturbing it again. The rain outside felt like a blessing, washing away the darkness that had plagued the place. As they left the house, they looked back, knowing that the battle was not over yet. Eliza Morgan's curse had been contained, but not completely destroyed. They also knew that the darkness would find a way back, as it promised. Months passed, and David and Sarah kept a watchful eye on the abandoned house. They knew they needed to be ready for any eventuality. However, tranquility seemed to return to the small town, and the mysterious disappearances stopped. As time passed, David and Sarah continued their research, determined to learn more about the nature of Eliza Morgan's curse and how to prevent it from resurfacing. They understood that the supernatural was a complex world full of mysteries, and that their work was far from over. The police terror that had begun with a series of mysterious disappearances had finally met its end, at least for now. David and Sarah learned that evil can take many forms, including those that defy human understanding. As they watched the rain fall on the abandoned house, they knew the darkness would always find a way back, but they were willing to face it no matter what the future brought. The knowledge they gained from this terrifying experience made them guardians against the unknown, ready to protect your city and all those who were in danger. And so, they continued their journey, ready to face any challenge the supernatural world could throw their way.